Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you've never been here before. My name is Shelley. I am a watercolor artist in Ontario, Canada. And every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, that's Toronto time, I will teach a watercolor demonstration. So last week we did a beautiful red tulip, and we didn't put a background on it, so that's what we're going to do today. And if you're just joining, I would like you to mention where you're from. I would also appreciate hearing what has been your best takeaway from watching any of my previous demos. This is going to help me to figure out what is the best information for me to share. So if you could let me know what has been the best takeaway for you, I will try to include more of that information in future demos as well. So we have, we've got Kingston, New Hampshire, Columbus, Denver, Pennsylvania, Manitoba, Richmond Hill, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Belgium, Indiana, all over the place. Thank you so much. I always love seeing where everybody's from. Okay, so let's head on over to my workspace here, and we'll take a look here at where we left off. Just a quick review of the materials that I've used. I'm using Arches 140-pound cold press bright white paper. I have pre-stretched it, which means that I have soaked it for 3 minutes in room temperature water, and I stapled it down, let it dry fully, and then I taped off the sides. This keeps it very, very flat. It allows it to dry 100% ready to frame and everything. And then you don't get that sort of rippled look underneath the mat, and that always shows up quite prominently. So the paint colors I'm using here, I'm using mostly a Da Vinci watercolor palette here. This one is Rose d'Or. This is the warm red that we used. I used permanent alizarin crimson for some of the darker shadows. And I also, sorry, I just got a weird thing that popped up, and I've never seen it before. It's asking me if I want to snooze this live stream. No, I don't want to. I also used a gamboge, which is a hue, actually. And these are the colors that I used, and you can review that in the first part of this particular demonstration. I've put that link underneath this video so that you can access that easily. The brushes I'll use an assortment of brushes. I actually like squirrel hair brushes, but for those of you that are conscious of the use of animal hair and that sort of thing, synthetic brushes are great too. If you can find some that will actually hold a lot of paint, a lot of water, and have a nice sort of soft bristle, those will work just fine too. So mostly rounds here that I'll be using, and we will be using quite a bit of paper towel here, because when I paint, this is my style now. I'm painting kind of realistically, but when I paint, I'm always thinking about the control of water or paint and how much moisture is in my brush. So I use my paper towel for blotting my brush. That's my method of controlling how wet my brush is, because that's so important. I hope that one of the takeaways is that you're more aware of what is going on in your brush and on your paper surface. When I'm teaching in person, that is one of the things that I see most often, I think, is people are not conscious, I guess, of what is happening. and so they're not really understanding why problems are arising. So now let's just take a look here at this background. Now this was a reference picture which I printed off on ordinary copy paper, so compared to this digital image on your screen, it's fairly dull looking, you can tell. We're limited to the printer's ink colors and capability and the type of paper that it's printed on and everything. It's not printed on nice photo paper or anything like that. But it's enough information that's going to help me to work things out here. So I obviously have a few of the colors that are going to repeat from the flower. I'm going to be using some of those colors, which I mentioned earlier. I'm going to be using a variety of greens, and I want you to notice how blue this green is. It's almost just blue because of the coolness. And some of these other greens are quite yellowy. So you'll notice that when the sun hits the leaf directly, like face on, that it's a nice cool light. But when we see the shadows or the, we're seeing sort of the side angle of some of these leaves, that they're actually quite yellowy. So we need to make sure that there's a good variety in there. And of course there's some darks, and there's a couple of odd colors here. Like there's like a tiny bit of pink, yellow up there. I won't even bother with that because that would get cropped off with a matting anyway because it's so close to the edge. There's little bits of pink in here. I might not bring too much attention there. That's right in the corner, and I don't really want to draw a new color and something very contrasty in the corner. So I'm going to be careful about this little corner here. I do find that the placement of this, I guess that's a bud coming up, right? A new bud just emerging, and we're looking at it from straight above. So it looks a little odd, especially the placement to the flower here. So what I might do is I might shift this over or even just completely remove it. That just might make things compositionally a little bit stronger. So those are going to be some of the choices that I'm making as I'm doing this. One other thing, besides this being blue, a blue-green, I want you to notice that, gosh, there's a lot of white paper showing through there. I hope you can see that that's what I'm talking about here, is that the paint is not only blue, but it's thinner, and it's allowing a lot of that white. And there's some areas over here where there's so much light directly on those leaves that it's very, very bright. So lots of light paper showing through here. As I come down into these yellowy greens, I'm going to be putting on a little bit more paint. I'll be mixing more paint into my mixture as I'm creating my puddle of color. So I'll be putting in more paint there, and certainly where there's some darks here. For some of these darks, I'm probably going to be using a lot of Payne's gray. Payne's gray is a really good dark for this type of thing, where you really want to have higher contrast in your shadows. So I'm not really using any mixed greens. I'm going to be mixing my own. And from my palette here, I'm probably going to use some cerulean blue, which is a beautiful sort of turquoisey kind of blue. That's a nice turquoisey type blue. I'll also use some cobalt blue, and you can see that there's a slight difference between those two. Get a little more of this cerulean out here. Now, before we started, I did wet some of my color. I wet my entire palette, actually. I put a generous amount of water in each of my wells. I've been allowing that to soften up the paint for the last 10-15 minutes or so. And so now I've got two blues here. And if I put in, make a puddle of yellow, this is Aureolin. Let me open up my colors here. I don't know if you can even read those. They're pretty dirty. But Aureolin is a nice lemony yellow kind of color. It's very cool yellow. But I may occasionally use some warm yellow as well. So I'm going to use that gamboge, which we did use in our main tulip as well. And yeah, so I can make a lot of my greens from there. And of course I'm going to be using some Payne's Gray. So before I put any of my greens down, that's what I'm going to use for a lot of my greens, but I'm also going to be using some of my red colors. And yes, the cerulean is somewhat opaque. I will have to use it thinner in order to make it allow some of that white paper to come through. I'm not going to be using a tremendous amount of it. So depending on how much you're using, the opaqueness of a color can be very problematic. Yeah, you could definitely substitute for things like maybe a phthalo or something like that. Those staining type colors, they are smoother, they are less opaque, that sort of thing. Whatever colors you have on your palette, give them a try. See how they look by comparison to your reference picture. Maybe try some of them out. So if I try out this cerulean, you can see that it's actually a pretty good color for this. And some other areas, then if I start mixing this, I'll get other greens and that sort of thing. So you can see that's just straight cerulean. It's not far off of what we need. So it's kind of surprising. But I am keeping in mind that this has turned out, this coloring here on this printout is a little different than what I see here. So I'm going to try to use this as much as possible. So as we look at this reference, I can see that almost everything, there's a lot of things that are really in focus here. But there's some things that are a little out of focus. There's softer focus. I can control this. As a painter, I can control how soft it is, how wet it is. And the way that I can do that is by controlling how wet I make this, how wet I'm painting into a wet surface. So if I go into a wet surface with a drier brush, I will be able to get the paint to stick in that spot more than if I were to put it in with a really wet full brush with color. So if you have any questions, I should have mentioned this right at the start, but if you have any questions, can I ask that you put them in capitals? It's a lot easier when I'm kind of playing whack-a-mole here by working the cameras and the painting and the talking and everything. So I have to skim the chat, and if you put your questions in capitals, that'll make it a lot easier for me to find it. So now this goes entirely around this tulip. This can be a little bit of a problem. So the reason it's a problem is because, I want to put it all in wet on wet, but I may not get it all done. So how am I going to manage that? And for me, it's much easier to do it in smaller digestible bits. So here's how I manage that. If I were to take my tulip here, and I'd have a couple of lines drawn in here, just a few of them. I didn't draw everything of the background on here. That's not necessary. So I'm just going to come in and I'm going to start wetting. And I'm going to be careful of my tulip. You can see it instantly starts to make things run a little bit. So I have to be careful that I don't reactivate my tulip red. So I'm going around this carefully. Try not to hit my red. And I'm wetting an area. Now I'm starting here. It's wet here, but I'll start painting up here. And that's because if I started painting here, I would have a hard edge as I start painting. So I'm going to wet an area much larger than what I think I can manage at one time. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to start in the upper left corner. If you're left-handed, you start in the upper right corner. And that's just so we're not putting our hand in wet paint. So I'm coming around here, and I'll go right over to the edge there. Come right down into here too. So I've got my colors ready, softened up on my palette, ready to go. And I'm going to start looking, and I'm just going to work my way across as I'm applying the color. On a wet surface, don't forget, you've got to have your paint much darker than what you really want to end up with, because everything gets so much more diluted as you paint. So I'm adding a little yellow to that cerulean, a little bit of my aureole into my cerulean, and you can see it makes quite almost a turquoisey kind of green. I'm going to blot that on my paper towel. That blot on my paper towel, that's what's making this not so wet, which means that when I put color down, it'll stay where I'm trying to put it, rather than bleeding out all over the place and without any control at all. And I know it seems kind of, well, it seems like, oh my gosh, you're taking off the color. Now you're not going to have any color to put down there. Yes, I may lose a little color, but that's why I said you need to really pump up the color. And when I'm blotting this belly part here, not the tip. That's where the paint is. So I'm blotting this belly part. Maybe if I put my towel on the belly part, the middle part here, then you'll see that I'm not removing all the paint. I'm just removing some of the excess water trapped in the brush. Now this is where, if I didn't get up to my edges with my water, I can come up to my edges with my paint very carefully here now. So even though I've got a big area to do, I can actually not panic. I can put this in without really feeling like I'm pressured into speed. For me, that's a big, the big benefit. So I'm going to add a little Payne's Gray to this just to make a darker version. Catherine's asking, I seem to prefer to do the background last. Well, in this case, Kathy, I actually wasn't really sure if I was going to get the background done last week, so I started with the flower. Sometimes I do the background first, especially if it's a white flower. I'll do the background first, because that makes it a lot easier for me to work out in my head and visually whether or not I am applying too much color or not enough color to my white flower, because white's sort of a very delicate type of color to manage, right? So I want to have some darks in there for comparison, and so if I have a darker background, I would definitely put that in first. So there's that little leaf in the upper corner. Let's rinse my brush out, and I'm going to go to red. So let's take a little red here. I've got this Rose d'Or, and again I'm going to take some of the extra moisture out of my brush, paint some of that in. I can tell right away that my paint is not nearly dark enough. There's some more red tulip behind there, peeking out from behind a leaf, but it needs some shading too, so I'm going to take a little bit of that alizarin crimson. So my puddle that I'm working from on my palette, these puddles are not really watered down. They're pretty dense with color. Would I ever do the background first? Absolutely, yeah. Lots of times, as I mentioned, probably with something like a white flower, I would do that first. And as I said, I could have started with the background last week, but I didn't. So when I'm getting into some of my more yellowy green, I'm going to switch up my green here. I'm going to use my cobalt blue And I'm blotting my brush before I go into my color too, so that I'm not inadvertently diluting this color so much. Right, so I've got a more of a yellowy green here, but it's too bright. It's yellowy green, but I need it a little darker. So I'm going to add a little Payne's Gray to that, blot my brush, and I'm going to come in with a couple of little leaves in here. And again, this is where I can really come up to my flower and clean up the edge. And if I'm trying to paint this and things are running out of control and I have no, no shape to anything, then I can come in and blot my brush some more. Make sure my puddle over here isn't so wet. So make your puddle, if you're familiar with the term, the consistency terms where people talk about the paint consistency being tea or milk or cream or butter. I would say that this is a cream consistency, so fairly dense with paint, not as much water. Blot my brush before I go into there. Pull up some of that. I softened up my wells, and a couple of my wells are a little bit on the runny side right now, so I may have to blot my brush a little more than typical, but I'm coming in with some really dark green now in some of these areas. But you see, I can keep things fairly in control, even though the paper's still wet. But one thing I've got to keep in mind, I can't forget that what's going on here on the paper's getting drier. That means my brush has to keep getting drier too. So I have to be careful about that. And if I start getting a hard edge, that's my cue to stop. So I'm going to turn this a little bit. And why am I doing my background like this? In case you're not really thinking about why I'm doing it this way, I'm doing it this way so that everything in the background looks like it's got a soft edge, and so it's out of focus. I'm trying to get right up to the tulip here. That's better. Get in there with some darks. And blotting my brush. Get some more dark going on here. And it really truly does not need to match the photo. It really doesn't. I can create the kind of background I want. I don't have to follow this. It's out of focus. Who cares? I want to work a background that benefits the painting the most, not to copy the photo. So at some point I'm going to be looking at this and going, okay, forget the photo. What does the painting need? So I'm going to make my greens a little darker because my greens need to go back into the shadows a little more. So I'm putting a little more color in here, and that's going to blend next to that dark green. And hopefully you can see that those edges are really quite soft. Let's get into some red again. But look at this edge. This edge, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here for you. This edge is starting to get a little bit harder. Okay, you won't see where I'm blotting my brush. I'll make my hands dirty and hold it in my hand again. But so you'll be able to see as I'm blotting that. You can see this edge is starting to get a little bit dry. It's not nice and soft and fuzzy like this edge. This edge is starting to get a bit hard. That's my cue. Things are getting too dry. So if I take my brush and I blot it, and I dampen this and soften that edge. So now it is soft. But the most important part here, if I've got a dark color here and I come in and let's say I don't blot my brush, right? And I come in with wet color like this. My brush is really wet right now. You can see that what's going to happen is I'm making a blossom. That's not a good thing to have. So it's also making the paint kind of travel. Look at that blossom forming. That's not a good thing you want to have. So now out here, I can sort of wet ahead of where I'm going with my color. I can wet ahead of there. But I'll have to come back and deal with that blossom in a second. So I did wet this before, but now I'm wetting again so I can keep going. But it's a matter of connecting the previously soft stuff to the new soft stuff. But you have to, it's a bit of a juggling act because you have to do it while the paint is in various stages of dryness. And so I'm trying to control that by using my paper towel to control how wet or damp something is. So if I'm connecting up to something, instead of going up to it with something really wet, I'll come up to it with a blotted brush. And I can soften that. And look, I've managed to make that soft. I got rid of that blossom with just that dampened brush. And I can do that. I can also wait for it to completely dry, and then I could come in and do some more on top of that. So let's keep going with our color, and we'll work our way across. I'm going to take this rose door again. We've got a tulip hiding back here. I'm going to put a little more color down than that. But if this color's wetter, it's going to start pushing away at that green, which you can see that's kind of what's happening here. So I'm going to take my green, but my green had better not be really wet. It needs to be blotted on my paper towel. You can see on my paper towel how dry it is. And the same goes for this dark. So I'll start over here where it's getting kind of drier, and I'm going to walk up to it. And what's happening here now is that I've got two paints that are equal in consistency. I haven't got one wetter than the other. They're both equally wet now. I'm going to put some green in here at the same time. But I need to mix some more up, so let's get some more blue, some more yellow, touch of Payne's gray, my yellow puddle's getting a little low. I'm going to have to refill that soon. But blotting to make sure it's not too wet. Now red and green, right side by side. That could be very, very problematic if I'm not careful. If I start overlapping that red, that's going to turn quite dark and quite unattractive. Complementary colors sit beautifully side by side, but they are not good layered on top of each other. I'm going to make this a little bit more blue. Blot my brush, the belly part. Come in with a little bit more blue into this. So I'm kind of working damp here. I know the technique is called wet on wet, but I'm kind of thinking it's a little bit more damp on damp, if you will. seems to keep things in control. Now, let's face it, we're going to get to a point where it's like, it's too much. It's really starting to dry too much, and I'm going to have to stop. So that's fine. Stop, dry it, re-wet things, keep going. I say that all the time. It's a way to keep things sort of manageable. All right, so this background's starting to develop, and even though I wet that, it's not very wet. But I have to be careful I don't go really wet right up against that red. I have to really make sure that it's only damp there. It can be wet out here. I can go like completely puddle out here. But right next to that damp red, which has no shine, I bet I can't go really wet there. So last week I talked a lot about how shiny the paper is, and just to show you, you can see that there's a lot of shine here, and then it sort of fades away. And when I'm coming up to this red now, it's only damp. Like there's not a lot of water sitting on the paper. And I want to get, before this red does dry, I want to come in with some of my alizarin crimson. And again, this is sort of a cream consistency. It's not watered down color. It's cream consistency so that it'll stick to the paper when the paper's wet. And I'm not even really trying to make that look like a tulip. I see a shape, and that's what I'm painting in, just a shape. That'll be enough. And you can definitely see that, you know, what I'm doing in the background is a lot softer than my main tulip. And that's really going to create some perspective that will be, make this look even more realistic, more dimensional. It's interesting that when I use this sort of out of focus background technique on my paintings, and I post them on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, those links, by the way, are in the description. But when I post them, one of the comments I get almost all the time is, "Oh, it looks like a photo." And I guess I realize that that's intended as a compliment, but my intention was to create perspective. So it looks real enough, convincing enough that people are fooled into thinking it's a photo, and yet it's all soft lines. So it's very interesting how there's that perception. So I'm coming in with a little bit more blue here, and my brush is damp. I'll go Payne's Gray. And if I want to make a really dark green, I could take one of these yellows. Like, let's take this warm yellow, for example, and I mix that with my Payne's Gray. You'll see I get a nice dark green. Duller green, right? It's not going to be a bright green. It'll be a duller green, but it's really nice dark green if I need it. This one's a little bit more olive, but if I used the Payne's Gray and I used the other yellow, I get a different green again. So just out of those few colors, I can get like tons of different greens. What colors made the dark green? Well, I'm explaining that right now. So hopefully that answers your question. So if I take some of this aureolin, mix it with my Payne's Gray, I can make a different green. If I took the gamboge and mixed it with my Payne's Gray, you can see that one's maybe a little more olive. So you just get a variety of different greens with different yellows, different blues, and so on. Just going to mix up a little bit more color here. I know things are starting to dry on my paper, so I may just stop and dry. You know, if you're a little bit of a timid painter, a little nervous of trying some of these like really wet on wet backgrounds, that type of thing, worried about losing control and all of that kind of stuff, then yeah, dry in between, then re-wet, then just keep going. But the thing is, if you're going to stop to dry, make sure you don't have a hard edge anywhere before you stop. That's the one thing I would really strongly advise, is just make sure that you have smoothed off or softened with a damp brush. You've softened any hard edges. You know, like I did over here when I had that dark in there. Now this is a little bit of an edge here. This you know, it's a little bit crisp. It's not totally crisp, but it's, you know, a little bit crisper maybe than I want. I'm not going to play with that though. You know, if I have one edge that's a little bit crisper, that's okay. That's, you know, I'm not going to go back. There's something that you should think about, and that is sometimes the freshness in your painting is far more important than perfection, because if it makes it look like a painting, first of all, but more importantly, it keeps the freshness in your painting if you don't keep going back. So I could dampen this, I could keep going, but I'm going to dry it so that I can show you the technique of, you know, like let's say you get a phone call and you can't keep painting, and it's important and you can't keep painting. There's something like that going on. So I would stop, dry what you have. That's going to kind of set the colors, and then re-wet to keep going. Now the thing about drying it is that I can put water over top of this and it won't activate everything there. You just have to make sure that it's completely dry first. Now I'll take my time with these backgrounds. I know it kind of looks like it's whipped in and everything else, but you know, I'm a bit of a slower painter, and I will you know, I'll kind of ease my way into it. For me, it's a more comfortable way for me to paint without feeling the panic, and honestly, I just love the painting process. I mean, I'm more about the process probably than the finished painting, but I like trying to aim to see if I can make it as believable as possible. Make sure I'm not feeling any dampness. So everything's pretty dry there. I'm going to take my brush, nice and clean water here. Now let's go back and re-wet where I want to work into. So I'm bringing this over to here. My brush isn't as wet now because it's starting to run out of water. And I'm going to come up and I'm going to overlap some of this, but I can't brush it around a lot. That's definitely not something I want to do. So if I come up now and I start putting paint there, it's going to have a soft edge. It's this getting them to connect that is the tricky part, because people sort of start where they left off, and that's where the hard lines come in. So you can see that if I come in with some dark color here, it's going to have a soft edge. You can see it kind of softening as I go. Now let's get into more of that blue-green again. Lot. Okay, and then I'll just keep switching to, maybe there's some red back in here. No, there's not red back there. I looked in the wrong place. Bit of dark. Blot my brush so it's not too wet. That's how I'm going to keep things where I'm touching the paper instead of bleeding all over. And I'll try to move this on a little faster now that this is now that I've explained it all, and we'll move along and we'll see how this turns out. We'll put in some darks here. Back to my blue-green. A lot of color switching, a lot of brush blotting going on. Trying not to leave any white paper behind here. Come up to but not over my tulip. And I always want to make sure that I'm switching up my my greens, that I'm not making everything the same. I think that's so important. If you make all your greens the same, you end up with a very boring painting. You can take any combination and really start creating something back there. So onward and upward. Now you'll notice this background is not, it's not like a landscape where the background's really far away, right? If it were far away, like a distant mountain or something like that, sure, all this would be a lot duller. And maybe I do want to dull this a little bit. But because this is a garden and because this is really not that far away from my tulip, it's really just sort of directly behind, I don't want to make it too dull. I find in florals, if you make the flower so bright and then you make the background so dull, it looks like the background's really far away, which doesn't make any sense, right? So keep that in mind, that, you know, the bright colors can really bring life into this. Now, in addition to bright colors, I've got some real darks too. Don't forget about those. Those are very important as well. So I'm just going to keep, I won't maybe narrate every color change that I'm making here, but I am switching it up as I go. Trying to sort out one leaf from another as much as I can. And I am paying attention, you know, if I've got a leaf in front, I want to make sure I'm painting around it. And maybe putting the one behind, giving it a little bit more shadow. Now this area here, I wet it, but I can feel it. It's starting to dry. The window in which I can paint is starting to close. So let's make sure this edge doesn't end up being hard. So I'm going to take a blotted brush, damp blotted brush, soften that edge so it doesn't dry as a hard edge. And I'm going to try to get up into that corner at least. Pardon me. I haven't got all the frogs out this morning. I think it's partly allergies. So mix it up with different greens. Some of that has to be a little darker. It's almost like my brush has two colors in it right now, so sometimes when I lay it down on its side, I get actually kind of a two-tone thing, which is kind of cool. One of those happy accidents. Now this has a line. I'm looking at my reference and there's this petal that goes across, and I don't know, this is some other flower here, and it's got this sort of diagonal line. It's very contrasty and that sort of thing. So I don't like that sort of thing in the corners of my painting. So just thinking in terms of the composition, I don't think that that's a great thing for my composition. So I'm going to darken up that corner instead. We're gonna pretend there's something else back there than what the photo shows. So don't be afraid to change up what you see if it benefits the painting. I think that's very important, not to become, so dependent on your photo that you can't deviate from it in any way. I think that's very important to realize that you're the one in control, not the photo. This area I think should be a lot darker. Let's get some more dark in here. See, and you get to the point in this type of technique where you can kind of invent stuff, right? And that's very freeing, to be able to just paint something in and know that it's really just these triangles and sometimes lines and things like that. So that suggests stuff back there, but doesn't really describe it too well. All right, so I'm getting a hard edge. Let's deal with that. I'm going to get a new paper towel because that one's getting pretty saturated. Do not like the contrast in the corners because it takes away from the flower. Yeah, it does take away from the flower, but it's also a diagonal line which creates some tension up in the corner and kind of draws your eye to that corner. So I'd rather have lead-in lines rather than stop lines. It feels like when you look at the reference picture and you see that bright line against the darker these darker leaves and things, the shadows back in there, all of a sudden that's a high contrast. So I mentioned that earlier too, that in this corner here, you've got this strong contrast. Anything with contrast will draw your eye. So you don't want to draw the eye to the corners. Let's keep it where the focal point is here. And obviously with this flower, it's pretty hard not to see the focal point here, but in any case, I don't really want to have any dissecting corners. It's just a little distracting. So let's rinse out my brush. My water's getting pretty murky too, so I may take a moment and just switch up my water. But just before I stop here, I'm going to take my well-blotted brush and soften up these edges so that I don't have a crisp line there. I know I want to put a leaf in there that's a different color and so on, but I want to make sure that it doesn't have a hard line. So you can see all of what I've put in the background there is it's all got fuzzy edges. Don't get too fussy about things. You may, when you're right on top of something and you're looking at it, you're probably seeing things like, ooh, that's not a very soft line. That's kind of raggedy. Don't worry about that stuff. Like, that's so not important. Really, truly, it's not. Step back, and I'll post this later, and people will say, you can watch my Instagram to see if I'm right or not, but people will say, oh, that looks like a photo. And it's because it's out of focus. And why does something out of focus look more realistic than something that is in focus? That mystified me when I was learning to paint. I thought if I just made it more detailed, it would look more real. And it couldn't be less true, because think about how your eyes look, how your eyes operate, like how they work. When you're looking at somebody who's 3 feet away from you, you cannot see what's 10 feet behind them in focus. Your eyes don't have that ability. Even if I paid you $1 million, your eyes don't have that ability. So if you are focused on the thing that's 10 feet away, you can't see what's 2 feet away from you in focus either. So we have this ability with our eyes to zoom in and focus on a particular subject. And when we do that, other things are out of focus. So when you put things out of focus in your painting, it will make it look more real, right? It's more natural. It's the way we naturally see. So that's actually a good thing. All right, so now that my water is looking quite like you can't see my hand under here or anything, it's pretty dirty. So I'm going to rinse this out and keep going. This way, by rinsing my bucket, my water container, I'll be able to keep my colors fresh and clean all the way through. Sometimes people don't like to stop and rinse out the water, but honestly, it's an important thing to do. So just do that very quickly. All right, so it means a lot of sort of rinsing my brush as I go, but the reason I wanted to switch color, like a blue green to a red to a dark green to a yellow green to back to a red green or red and then back to a blue green and so on and so on. The reason I'm working away sort of systematically like this is so that when I'm working on an area, I know that the dampness level of the paper is all the same in that area because I've just wet it. So that's why I'm working the way I am. So this, I just rinsed out my brush and everything else, and I'm coming in now and I'm going to re-wet this. This isn't 100% dry. So if I come in and I start wetting all of this and I forget to dry this, what's going to happen? One of you is going to get the right answer here. So what's going to happen if I come in and wet this without drying it first? That's a quiz. You can put your answer in the chat. So I'm drying it because, well, I should give you a second. I know that there's a 60-second delay, and that I put that on this YouTube channel so that we can head off any spammers and things like that, if I'm watching close enough. There's a 60-second delay between when I ask a question and when you type your answer, because it allows me to filter out certain things that need to be filtered out. One of the hats I wear while I'm demonstrating helps to have staff, which I don't have. A blossom. Yes, you are correct. You're all correct. So I'm waiting for that to cool down. That's a heat gun I'm using. I have no masking fluid on here, so I can use a heat gun. But I have to wait for this to get back to room temperature before I paint on it, because if I start wetting on here and the paper's just hot, it's just going to totally soak into the paper or evaporate. So I wait for the paper to cool down again. So it's one thing for me to show you that, you know, I'm wetting an area, but if I don't explain the reason why I'm doing it, it's not very helpful, is it? So I need to tell you why I'm doing these things, which I sure wish somebody had done when I was learning watercolor. So now I'm starting to work my way down. I don't have to wet and completely around the tulip. I just need to go a long way past where I'm planning to stop, or, you know, beyond where I hope I can paint. Now, as I get up to here, I don't want to make this sopping wet. I'm just going to blot my brush. So where I'm making a connection, I'm only making my brush damp. Right? Let's take a look at the shine, if we can get that on there. It's not really showing that much on camera, but I get it a little wetter here. Maybe you'll see it. So the wetter your paper is, the more your paint is going to run as you put it on. It's also going to dilute it more. So I'm dampening the paper more so than really, really wetting it. I know I had mentioned last week that wetting things will keep things wet longer. It will buy you some time. But in this case, when we're trying to get dark color in one pass, I don't want it too wet. I want it damp so that it softens the edges, but I don't want it diluting my color too much. All right, so you'll just have to take my word for it that this is only damp here. My brush feels, maybe you can see the bit of damp. Like if I shook it on my tulip, there's no drops coming off, right? So my brush isn't wet, it's only damp, and I can come along here, soften that edge, or dampen that edge again, and then I can paint right up into here. So I want a yellowy green, and I will start painting in here with this yellowy green. But I need to blot it a little bit more. I can see it wants to travel a little more than I intend, so I blot it a little more. And one little tip that I could share is that as I'm starting to paint into an area and I'm not sure how wet my brush is, start in the middle of that section. Because if it bleeds more than I want, it's not going to ruin the shape if I start in the middle. I'm just looking at my camera here for a second. It looks like what you see on the screen looks to be like it's too light. So I'm going to just make a camera adjustment here just so that I can sorry, I've got the wrong thing selected here. Let me go this one. Okay. So I just want to adjust this slightly because I think what you're seeing on screen is lighter than what I'm actually painting. So I'm going to bring down the brightness on screen. I think it's because I have so many lights going here. I really do. I'm surrounded by a lot of lights. And yeah, that's probably better. There, so that's probably a little closer. I think it's probably still a little bit light, but we're getting there. So more yellowy green as I come in here and add this in. Now that kind of made a hard line there, didn't it? Because I stopped and I fiddled with my camera, and that damp edge didn't stay damp that long. So let's contend with that before we go any further. So I have a hard line that has formed. I'm going to rinse my brush and blot it. Blotting the whole brush, not just the tip. And I'm going to run that along that edge. And now that edge is soft. Okay, so I have a soft edge. That's what I was looking for. And I'm going to go a little darker here. By having a variety of greens, you can create form in certain leaves and things like that. If I make it all, if I paint a leaf one shade, it'll look very, very flat. So if I use various shades, you know, that's how I created the shape in the tulip too, right? I used a warm and then I used a cool. My paper is not tilted, no. I'm working flat. It is typically how I paint. I know there are a lot of people. I think if I'm doing a wash in a background that like a sky or something like that, I will definitely tilt my paper. But for this type of thing, no, my paper is not tilted. So let's keep going here. I can't yak too long. I have to keep painting. Otherwise, you know, what's going to happen? Things will dry. So I'm going to come in with some colors in here. And there's like a lot of busyness that's happening right in this little area here. So I'm just going to put in a bunch of lines and create something close enough. Always being careful around the tulip, of course. I don't really have a solution for you if you get kind of careless and overlap your tulip, because you've got that very staining Payne's gray that is overlapping your nice light fresh color on your tulip. I cannot help you. I'm sorry, but that's kind of how you have to work, and that's one of the reasons that I really like working this background, this blurry background, sort of slowly, because I want to be careful. I don't want to have colors overlapping when they're not supposed to, and that sort of thing, especially complementary colors like a green and a red. I have to be always thinking about the shape here, and I'm negative painting around the tulip here, putting a background in behind. So just going to soften that a little bit. Blot my brush and help it along. And I sure don't want to paint everything that way, but you know, if I need to soften an area, that's a good way to do it. So let's get back to some more yellowy greens. Nothing really bright or contrasty over here, just so many different types of greens as I'm working. But I can feel my paper is beginning to dry again, as it will, because, well, it's dry in here. It's cooler outside. I think the furnace is coming on, so I think that speeds up drying. If you live in a drier climate, you know, you may not be able to get certain things in fast enough because, you know, the humidity. I went to a symposium in Calgary, Calgary, Alberta, several years ago, and there were wildfires, as there are again right now, but there were wildfires. It was dry. Oh my goodness! Compared to Southern Ontario, where I live, it was incredibly dry. And in fact, I couldn't get used to it myself. I mean, talk about losing your voice. My goodness, I had to fill up the tub in order to humidify the air because it was. My eyes were beet red and my throat was dry and sore, and it was really not acclimatized to that sort of dryness. So if you're living in an area that's extra dry, you're definitely going to have to kind of keep the moisture on your paper going as fast as or as much as you can by keeping things damp. And if an area, don't try to work too large an area at one time. So this is starting to dry, so I'm just going to come in with clean water again right here. And yeah, my paper's wrinkling, but it will dry flat. So I'm coming around my tulip again, and as I connect to this is not as wet as what I just put here, This paint is beginning to dry. This is much wetter. So as I'm connecting them, my brush better not be really, really wet as I come up to it, or I'm just going to make a blossom. So back to more green. Let's go some different greens here. Maybe switch it up, make some more blue-green. Don't want to leave any white slivers around my tulip, so I'm taking my time coming right up to it, but I'm still working with quite a lot of control. That's okay. Water, Teresa, you're so right. The water control is something that every artist, every watercolor artist that I know has struggled with the most. That is the hardest thing, I think, for most people to get their head wrapped around. And understandably, because every climate is different, every every situation is different. The brush, the type of brush, the type of paper, how wet you make the paper. There's so many variables that it has to be a practice thing. There's just no way for me to quantify and tell you exactly. I can describe to you what I'm doing, but you still have to sort of feel that for yourself. Make your best guess. I'm creating a bit of a purple here, dull purple. I don't know why I see a purple here, but there is. And so I'm putting some of this in here. Edge of a leaf or something, I think. Or maybe it's a stem of some kind. Something interesting anyway, but not really bright. I don't want to make it bright, because as soon as I make something bright, it takes away from the flower. There we go. Now back to some greens. Gotta rinse my brush out. And come into some of my greens again. Some darks in there. Now this is where that lighter leaf is, that's getting a lot of light, and I see that it's kind of bending over like that. So it's got an edge there, and I'm trying to paint what's around it without making it look like I've gone around it, that I've just made it look like it naturally goes behind it. A lot of brush rinsing going on here, so I'm sure you can hear that. And as I start coming into areas where I need to have a lighter you know, I want to represent a lighter green. Now, it could be a blue green, or it could be a yellow green, or it could, you know, it could be anything. But if I want it to look lighter, I'm thinning my paint more. Diluting my color a little bit more so that it will look allow some of that white paper to show through. Now, I didn't wet all the way around. Let me move here. I'll move my camera this way. Right down to the bottom. I didn't wet beyond maybe here, so I'm going to have to continue wetting in ahead of where I'm working, because if I suddenly hit a dry patch, I'm going to know that pretty quick. But this, I will say that this is one technique that you don't want to go back in and repeat all your steps again, because, oh my gosh, that would be so much work. And you could potentially lose the freshness. So I highly recommend that you work to get the values correct, remembering how much lighter they're going to dry, but you want to work to get the values as correct as possible as you're applying the color. So I'm making this nice and wet here, but close to where I'm working, I'm going to, or close to where I just left off, I want to make sure that my brush is only damp there. Let's see. Only damp. I know it's still, there's still some dampness there, so I don't need to go really wet there. I needed to go really wet out here where I hadn't put any water. All right, so this is pretty saturated. Let's get a fresh one. This is where I need lots of that sort of blue-green. So I'm using lots of that cerulean hue. This one's a hue, by the way. Hue, if you're not familiar, is a substitute for an original color. Now I put that on and my brush was really wet. I didn't blot it, and you can see how far it's moving. So let's blot it and see how much more control I can have. I can keep it in that shape. It's not making blossoms around it. I'm sort of spreading out the color since it was so wet. You might expect that a leaf below the tulip there would be darker. I mean, it makes sense, right? If it's underneath, it's going to have a shadow on it, therefore it's darker. This is where the photo reference can really help you out, because not everything happens as expected. Here we have a very, very light leaf behind a very well-lit tulip. You know, we've got a lot of light here. So it's not as expected. Remember that you are always working, you know, if you're working trying to create something realistic, at least, that you have to understand the way that the light is hitting something. And obviously the light is hitting this in such a way that this leaf is getting lots of light. Otherwise it would be in shadow like some of these other ones in the background. But this one's actually getting quite a lot of color in there. It gets slightly more yellow on this side, which I like because it gives some variations. I love seeing variations within a color wash anywhere. So I'm going to come in with some, let's get in some of this a little bit darker, because we do need some dark, a little bit of darker over here. So I've added a little tiny bit of cobalt blue, a little bit of Payne's gray. I am getting a little bit of a blossom there that was a little bit wet. So let's take care of that before that becomes problematic. Rinse my brush, blot it well. You can see it's blotted well. And I'm going to gently work that blossom before it sets up and becomes a permanent part of my painting. Okay, so now that blossom is gone. If I pulled off too much color there, I can replace it with damp color, not wet color, but damp. So I can come in here and create that shape. Blot it again, soften it, and that should take care of that. Okay, so I got this funny corner down here. What am I going to do with that? Am I going to put in flowers? I might put in a little bit of flower, but I'm going to put it in a little duller. I'm going to use some permanent alizarin crimson, a little bit of cobalt blue, make a dark purple, darker than what I see in the photo, just because I think I don't want to bring a lot of attention here. But I'm going to put some of these, the suggestion of some of these purple flowers in here, which I'm just kind of dabbling in, not investing a lot of time trying to create the form exactly, but and this is actually 2 petals here, 2 leaves. So let's get a little bit of shadow on one side here. A little bit more cobalt blue. My brush is only damp. My brush has to get drier along with the paper getting drier. My brush, get some darks in here. I want to get some of that Payne's gray, put some gaps in here. I really had to blot my brush here so that I don't lose control of these darks. I want to keep them I want to keep them between these leaves, not on top of. That would be very weird. Ooh, looks like I'm hitting a dry spot. So I had better get that under control. Rinse my brush, blot it, and run that along that edge that's becoming hard as soon as I put it down. So run that along and that edge gets soft. So I think I'm at the point, I didn't wet very far beyond here, so I think it's at the point where I need to stop and dry this. And yep, that's definitely making a hard line. So I want to soften what I've got here. Then I'm going to dry it, and then I'll just re-wet, and I'm going to keep working my way around. Now that you've seen it up close, I'm going to zoom out too, because then you start to see the whole picture. It always feels so unusual when you're working on it, but then as more gets built up, you can see it starting to develop, and it's like, oh, all those things that look so horrible up close, when you put it all together, it looks fine. I dripped some paint on there. It doesn't matter. It's going to be well covered anyway. Not going to stop to try to scrub any of that off. I even smeared some paint from last week. Just going to wipe off my tape. This looks better. Keeps any paint from working its way back onto my painting. I know the paper is getting dry when it gets a little bit flatter. So we're getting to that point where we have this this funny little bud coming up, which is oddly placed. It's sort of like right in the middle, right near the bottom. I think I might allude to that, but I'm going to maybe put it off to the side a little bit more, just to make it a little more asymmetrical, and maybe it's just a weird placement in my mind. So I'm not loving that placement, so I'm going to move it, even though it's not where, like, you know, where it is in the photo. I don't like it, so I'm just going to move that over, which means I'm going to have to invent a little bit in terms of some of the greenery. But when this is cool enough, I'm just going to wet this area. And damp over the spot I just did, only damp. Don't move the paint around a lot. Don't get it so wet that it softens up, all that sort of thing. But I do need to connect it, so just damp where I've put the previous color. Remember, I had previously wet that area. Now I did dry it, but it may still have a little of that dampness in the core of the paper, like in the middle of the paper. So I don't need to make that really wet. Let's take some of that rose door, and I'm going to put my red tulip here. And maybe what I'll do is I'll make it connect to the previous tulip. And by doing that, it won't feel like it's so separate, you know, kind of this, you know, perfectly round ball that's at the bottom below the main tulip. So if I do that and put it off center a little bit, I think that's going to solve that sort of weird shape and weird contrast down there. So I'm going to put in some of it's all the same colors as I was using before. I didn't undercoat that with the yellow, but this is a background, and I don't really need this as bright and brilliant as my main subject. So I'm not going to worry about undercoating some of these reds with my yellow here. I'm just suggesting it, right? Don't need to, see, out of focus, just a bunch of blur, right? And we'll just make that look like it's tucked in behind the other tulip. Right, another one emerging. Rinse my brush out, switch my color. I'm going to come in with some more of that cerulean blue. Let's get some of that mixed up. Not too runny. I want a little bit of control here. Okay, let's create these shapes in here. I can touch the color, I just don't want to overlap it. Now, if you were here last week, I think I talked about those pom-poms. Pom-poms, which is not a not a technical term. This is just one that I made up, but it describes well, I think, the effect of lifting your brush on a wet surface and having a resulting sort of pom-pom that forms. So, like for example, here, if I stop and lift my brush, you can see that's starting to make this little dot that's growing. So if you want to avoid any of those, go the opposite way. Start where you finished off and come back into the big area instead of going and tapering off, and start where the taper is and then go into the big area. Because then if I lift the brush in the middle of this, well, what's no harm, right? Okay, let's start getting some darks in here. I can feel this already starting to want to dry. I probably missed a spot there with water, but ooh, look how this is drying already. So I need to keep edges soft. Let's blot my brush. I'm going to run that along the edge of this just to keep things soft. Get in some darks in here. And we'll add in a few little stems and leaves and various greenery down in here. Let's go yellowy green in there. I want the edge of this light colored leaf to look like it's got form. So I'm running along with a blotted brush here. Really trying to be careful not to make an odd shape here on this background and the leaf. And I get asked this quite a lot, but why wouldn't I be using something like a spray bottle to keep this wet? A spray bottle would be awesome, except for the fact that I can't control with any certainty that I'm not going to get spray on my tulip, and then I'm going to have colors bleeding into my tulip, and I don't want that. So unfortunately, this is not a candidate for using my spray bottle. And that's just the reality of it. So as I said, I'm going to have to invent a few things down in here. It seems to be more of that yellowy green, so let's get a little more sort of yellow into this. Switch it up though, don't make it all the same. Gotta go some bluer greens sometimes. And don't forget, you want to think, oh, how thin is that color? Is that a dark shadow, or is that a color that's in light? Do I need to make that lighter looking? And that sort of thing. These are all questions that should be going through your head. What do I do to make distant mountains, colors, values, changes? We have 4 layers of different mountains in Maine, and I have trouble with each layer, blue, purple. Well, it probably depends on the atmosphere or the lighting as well on the mountain. So my suggestion is take a photograph, because atmosphere often removes the warm tones. So like the particles in the air and so on, at a distance, it doesn't pick up reds, it doesn't pick up the contrast and so on. You're looking through the finest particles suspended in the air, and dust, pollen, all of that sort of thing. And so things in the distance will look different. We have an interesting thing going on here in Canada right now. We have a lot of wildfires in Alberta. I really hope that all resolves itself before too long. But in Alberta, they have these wildfires. And here in Ontario, we're talking like, I don't know how many miles it is, but probably a couple thousand miles away. And our sunsets, the sun is looking very like a red ball. It's the weirdest thing. It doesn't look like a normal sunset, and it's because of the smoke in the air. And so certain things will affect the way that you see things in the distance. And smoke can be one of those things. Pollen, dust. Like if you live in an area where it's very dry and there's a lot of sort of dust particles in the air, like sand, that sort of thing, it can affect how things look in the distance. The type of mountains, like in Maine, I know you don't have like Arizona type mountains or hills where you have the red and all of that, but the type of clay, is it covered in snow? Is it, the season? There's so many variables. I would say trust your own eyes in terms of those colors and distance, in the distance, but looking at your photo, it may not be that obvious. When I'm looking at a painting and I'm trying to find color that doesn't exist. So for example, if I'm painting a white flower and I do all of my shadows gray because I think, well, yeah, that's what a shadow would look like if it were white on a white object, well, then I'm assuming things. So sometimes I have to really hunt and see, okay, is there any color being reflected in there? And what's that doing? Is it looking more warm or is it looking more cool? And I'm asking myself by looking. So I guess what I'm saying is try to develop, look harder at your reference, or look harder when you're looking at a mountain, and ask yourself the questions of, what colors are hiding behind that gray. Like, there's usually color, so look closely. Sometimes you will see it more purple. Depends on if the light maybe is behind you or in front of you. There's so many variables. There's no one right answer to that. Unfortunately, I wish I could give you just the formula, but you have to look for those things. All right, so I'm coming in. I need to get some more darks in here. Let's create some more greenery in here. I'm going to separate these petals, or these leaves, I should say. But I can see a hard line forming, which is telling me that I better get things softened up before they become a permanent hard line. Let's see. Tuck in a few more darks that would look appropriate in here. Now I moved my tulip over, so I have to keep that in mind, that I've moved it over, so I can only estimate sort of where things would be here at this point, because I deliberately moved that over. And I need to get some darks in around the bud here as well, so make it look like it's tucked in, because it's kind of poking out of these leaves. But things are really starting to dry. I could potentially just stop here, you know, because this is going to happen to you at some point. You know, you didn't get everything in that you wanted to, even in this little area. So what do? Dry it, wet it, add it in. It's really that simple. You don't have to make it complicated. And I'll do that. I'll just dry this right now. And then I really want to zoom in on some of this, and so you can see it's really not that precise. You know, really not being that precise. And does it matter? You have to ask yourself, how much does it matter that I'm precise? You'd be amazed how loosely you can paint a background and pull it off. As long as your main subject has the contrast, the detail, the brightness of color, whatever the case may be, as long as your subject has the attention it requires, your background really doesn't need that much. I like Tiny Face's comment here. She's determined, or he's determined. I don't know if it's she or he, but you're determined, and that, I have to say, is probably the main ingredient in successful watercolor, being determined. If you're not determined, you probably don't have the stomach for what's required in order to put in the work. Because, you know, there's going to be work. You have to actually pick up the brush, apply it to the paper, and really, you know, put in the mileage. That's the only way. How are you going to know how much to blot your brush unless you're actually doing it? You won't. So, oh my gosh, look at the time. This is going long, but I'll get in as much as I can done here. I'm going to re-wet this. Let's get that brush a little cleaner. And as I said, I'm going to go over some of this so that I can add in some of those darks around that bud. Don't brush this around too much. If you start brushing around, you start moving paint. As soon as you do that, you start contaminating all of the colors you put in there. And I've seen people do that so many times. They get brush happy, and they start coming in and brushing, and then it gets really difficult to well, once the freshness is gone, it's gone. That's an unfortunate reality, is that, you know, if you lose that freshness, you can't get it back. I don't have a solution for that one. I have tried many times, but getting freshness back is not something that's possible. Once it's gone, get a new piece of paper, do it again, see if you can get it right the next time. Just be more conscious of what you're doing. All right, so with just a little bit of Payne's Gray in my brush, let's blot that. And I'm going to come around this bud, and hopefully I can get some nice, good, strong darks in here. That's not even softening as much as I'd hoped, so let's help it along a little bit here. Sorry, I know my hand's in the way right now, but I need to work at an awkward angle sometimes. See, can't do it sideways. Get paint where I don't want it. So, just trying to soften those edges a little bit. Tuck in a few darks. All right, so you get the sense, hopefully, that there's another tulip there, and it's starting to emerge from a lower angle. Blotting my brush, softening my edges if I'm not getting it soft enough. But it is a lot easier to wet the paper first. I just didn't get that one wet enough. So let's just keep going here. More yellowy green. Let's grab some of this. I've got some over here. Trying to work a little faster here. Don't want to keep you tied up. I know you've got things to do today. I do. I have a class this afternoon. So I need to get through this, wrap this up, and get some darks in here. So depending on the kind of painter you are, I mean, you can spend a lot of time doing this, really fine-tuning this and getting it exactly the way you want it. Or, you can go much faster. It all depends on your personality. I think how you paint is like a signature. All your brush strokes, like you hold your brush a bit different. Your brush itself might be different. There's just so many variables. Even if I don't follow my photo exactly, so if I have a variety of greens and sort of geometric shapes in here, you'll be amazed what I can pull off. Convincing the viewer that something's there that's really not, not in the photo kind of thing. Go a little darker down in here. It's tucking down into that little corner. Keeping an eye, is there any fuzzy edges or any edges that aren't fuzzy that I need to soften? Hit that with a blotted brush. Oh, my paper is not as wet up there. That means I have to dampen it and soften those edges. The thing is I guess, as I'm painting in certain areas and I find dry patches, it's bound to happen, right? Doesn't mean I have to live with it. That's going to make a really hard edge if I let that dry that way. I just want to finish this while I have the correct color in my brush. Okay, so rinse my brush. Let's hit this edge with a blotted brush, and that softened that. Done. Now I can come in and add some more in here. Be careful, I'm not hitting my tulip here. I can feel immediately when I hit a dry patch. I've got to smooth that out. All right, let's see. I've got this really light area right in here. I'm going to try to make that peek through. So I'm even going to maybe leave some of that. I'll just paint with a rinsed brush so that a lot of that white paper kind of shows through, but I don't want it too much contrast. This is one thing I want to be careful of. I want it lighter. I want to paint thinly, but I don't want it pure white or hard lines. That'll really draw attention to that spot. So if I want that to look lighter, I make the part around it look darker. I had a little undissolved bit of Payne's Gray in that brush load. I'm going to spread that out. Lots of different shapes. Too much contrast right here. Let's tone that down. I've got a real dark and quite a light, so let's overlap those a little bit. Get those two calm down a little bit. So some of this is a little bit different than the photo, and that's okay. It'll look fine. I won't tell if you won't. So let's get some more dark greens mixed up in here. Blot my brush. Painting that little triangular shape in there. Tucking it back into the background, you know, that makes it look further away. And I think I have my shape a little different here, but we can dampen this area. So I feel that starting to dry a little bit, so let's just re-dampen this area up at the top. Come in with a little bit more. Got another piece of undissolved paint there. There we go. And it looks like there's some more red back there, probably another tulip. Just a little bit right here. Have to come up to that the edge of my existing tulip and not overlap it as best I can. But if I do overlap it, I could wait till it's dry and bring my brush over top, blot it, and that will take care of that overlap. And there's not that much showing on my photo that gives me information about what to paint here, so I'm just going to invent a little bit here. Put in some darks. Let's put in a dark shape over here. Slowing it down to keep the shape of my main tulip straight. My brush, this, you can see this paper towel is getting pretty murky, pretty wet, and grab a new one. You can, if you can manage to work fast, of course that, that will come with more experience, but until then, until you feel comfortable working fast, it's nice to know that you can slow it down and work at a pace that's not going to make you feel stressed. I mean, gosh, who wants to paint stressed? Not me. That's not fun. And that potentially could be one of the reasons why some people give up on watercolor, because they feel like they have to get it all in one pass, like one quick motion, and they don't have enough experience yet. And there's a lot of people who make it look like so simple. Here, just go like this, 1, 2, 3, and don't explain exactly what's going on in their head, and so that makes it really challenging. Anyway, I could go in, dampen, darken, whatever I want to, but overall, I'm pretty happy with the finished result here. I could maybe put in a little shadow here, that type of thing. It's just a matter of I want to let all of this dry. Then I'm going to redampen areas. I just have to be careful when I'm redampening something that I am not moving around too much of the color that's underneath. So make sure that the first layer is fully dry before you go back in. And I hope that gives you some idea of how I approach some of those blurry, out of focus backgrounds. And now it's hopefully giving you that idea that the tulip is much closer to me than some of those other things in the background. Now, I just want to make sure I haven't missed any questions. How do I feel about defining some areas with colored pencils? You know what? For some people, they will go ahead and put in colored pencil. For me, on a textured surface like this, colored pencil or watercolor pencil does accentuate the grain of the finish. Now, this is a cold press, so it has a little texture. And if it's a bumpy texture, then it tends to show that, emphasize that. So personally, I don't like it, but it's not wrong, and you certainly could do that. I want to make sure I haven't got any other questions I haven't missed here. I think, let me see here. I think that's the only question I missed. Okay, so that'll wrap this one up for today. Thank you so much for joining me for this. If you want to help me out, then go under the video, hit the like button there. I appreciate the thumbs up in the chat too, but they don't tell YouTube anything. So if you want to tell YouTube that you like my video, then you have to hit that like button underneath the video. And have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next Wednesday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That's Toronto time. And we'll see you then. Have a great week. Bye.